The Norvith Dominion had conquered 100 worlds and crushed 1,000 rebellions, their warriors bred for battle, their strategies honed over centuries of relentless conquest. To them, war was an art form, a sacred test of supremacy. They did not simply destroy their enemies, they proved, with elegance and brutality, that resistance was futile. And now, their gaze had turned toward Earth. Grand strategist Krilzar stood before the Dominion's High Council, his imposing figure framed by the holographic projections of Earth's surface. He exuded the confidence of a leader who had never tasted defeat. His deep-set, predatory eyes flicked across the planetary data streams, unimpressed by humanity's crude weapons and scattered defenses. "Our analysts report that Earth is an anomaly," he declared, his voice reverberating through the chamber. "They are technologically primitive, yet have survived against their own self-inflicted destruction. They lack unity, yet they persist. If they are to join the Dominion, we must test their worth." A ripple of agreement passed through the assembled warlords. It was tradition. Before a civilization was assimilated, they had one chance to prove themselves through single combat. It was a formality more than anything. The Dominion had yet to face a species capable of besting its champions. Krilzar continued, gesturing toward the three warriors standing at attention behind him. "As tradition dictates, we shall send our finest." General Servex, towering at 12 feet, his four muscular arms resting on the hilts of his plasma sabers, gave a slow, menacing nod. His exoskeletal armor gleamed under the council chamber's artificial light, his reputation needing no embellishment. He had personally crushed the resistance on 7 planets. Beside him, Clorvax the Devourer shifted his bulk, his clawed feet scraping against the obsidian floor. He was less a warrior and more a weapon in living form, a bioengineered nightmare whose very name sent lesser species into fits of terror. His ability to carve through starship hulls with his bare hands made his opponent's armor little more than decoration. Finally, AI-98, the tactical war construct, analyzed probability models in real time, calculating every possible outcome of the upcoming duel. Its synthetic mind had never encountered an opponent it could not predict. Every battle a mere sequence of inevitable defeat for its enemies. The High Council's approval was swift, and the challenge was dispatched across the cosmos. The humans would have one chance, one warrior to prove their species worthy. On Earth, the transmission arrived in the expected chaos of bureaucratic inefficiency. The message should have been intercepted by the highest levels of planetary defense, but instead, it took an alternate route. Through a mishap in routing protocols, a translation error, and an intern's misplaced lunch order, the challenge eventually landed in the Department of Extraterrestrial Affairs. Buried under a backlog of unresolved UFO reports and conspiracy theory complaints, the official communication was misfiled under non-urgent inquiries. By the time it was flagged as important, most of the planet's actual military strategists were unavailable. Some engaged in geopolitical posturing, others tangled in funding debates, and one particularly promising candidate reportedly stuck in a government-issued Zoom meeting that had been running for 4 consecutive days. Desperate to meet the deadline before an international incident arose, the department fell back on an emergency combat readiness protocol that hadn't been updated in decades. By the time anyone realized the process was flawed, a name had already been selected. Maggie Blackstone did not know what a Norvith was, nor did she particularly care. She had more pressing concerns, namely the fact that something had been scaring her cattle for weeks. The radio chatter about some intergalactic challenge meant nothing to her until a group of nervous officials showed up at her farm, explaining in a mix of half-hearted apologies and bureaucratic jargon that she had been randomly selected to represent Earth. The Nebraska sun was high, casting long shadows over the fields, her crops swaying in the late summer breeze. She stood with arms crossed, unimpressed by the 3 government agents attempting to explain how a clerical error had resulted in her being Earth's champion. "So let me get this straight," she said, chewing the inside of her cheek. "Y'all need a fighter, and somehow in all the world, you landed on me?" One of the agents, a pale man with an unfortunate mustache, cleared his throat. "Technically, Mrs. Blackstone, you weren't chosen. It was more of a procedural anomaly. You filed a complaint about extraterrestrial disturbances, and due to a misclassification in the system, your application was... Maggie raised a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. I don't give a raccoon's backside about your paperwork problems. What exactly am I supposed to do? The second agent, this one slightly more composed, tried to steer the conversation. It's a ceremonial combat event. Strictly one-on-one. We believe the Norvith are testing our capabilities. Maggie exhaled sharply through her nose. And what do I get out of this? The agents exchanged nervous glances. The answer, it seemed, was nothing. Maggie, whose patience had already been worn thin by an alien spaceship flattening her north pasture, rubbed her temples. Fine, I'll do it. But y'all better fix my damn fence when this is over. Before she had time to reconsider, a shimmering beam of light engulfed her, the farm dissolving in an instant as she was whisked away toward the stars. The last thing she heard was the startled mooing of her cattle. The transition from Earth to the Norvith war moon was instantaneous, her boots crunching against a foreign surface that felt suspiciously like polished stone. The arena stretched out before her, towering walls lined with alien spectators, their multi-eyed faces watching in anticipation. She adjusted her overalls, dusting off stray hay that had traveled with her. At the far end, the warriors of the Dominion made their entrance, each step a declaration of power. General Cervex drew his plasma sabers, the energy humming through the air. Chlorvax flexed his talons, the ground beneath him splitting under the force of his movement. AI-98's robotic eye pulsed with cold calculation. The Grand Announcer, an insectoid creature with a voice like grinding metal, began the formalities, proclaiming the might of the Dominion's warriors, the sacred nature of the combat, and the long-standing tradition of proving superiority through battle. The cheers that erupted from the crowd were deafening. Maggie, in contrast, rolled her shoulders and tested the grip of her shovel. A hush fell over the arena as the combatants took their positions. Across the battlefield, the warriors of the Norvith towered, their movements measured and lethal. Maggie, for her part, adjusted her stance and frowned. Well, she muttered, shifting her grip on the shovel. Let's get this over with. The signal to begin echoed through the war moon, and Maggie Blackstone, a farmer from Nebraska, faced down the deadliest warriors the galaxy had to offer, completely unaware of the chaos she was about to unleash. The air in the arena thrummed with anticipation, a million alien eyes fixed on the spectacle unfolding before them. The war moon of Kragath Prime had seen centuries of bloodshed, countless duels fought in its grand coliseum, but never had the stakes felt so peculiar. The Norvith Dominion had called upon humanity to prove itself, expecting cybernetic warriors or genetically enhanced super soldiers. Instead, they had been sent a middle-aged farmer in overalls, gripping a dented shovel like it was just another day tending to her crops. General Cervex stood at the ready, his 4 arms flexing, each muscle carved by years of battle. His plasma sabers hummed in anticipation, the blue glow casting jagged reflections across his chitinous armor. The Norvith knew fear, but they wielded it as a weapon. Cervex would not falter. The woman before him was a tactical mystery, her selection an enigma, but she was still just a human. Soft, fragile. The crowd roared, confident in their champion's inevitable victory. Maggie Blackstone, in contrast, was unamused. The sheer scale of the arena, the alien warriors, the towering walls of an empire that had never known defeat, none of it impressed her. She had spent her life in the scorching Nebraska sun, her hands calloused from years of tilling the land. She had seen droughts, tornadoes, and the kind of bureaucracy that could break lesser men. Compared to that, this was just another problem to solve. Cervex moved first, a blur of speed and precision. He launched himself forward with terrifying grace, his sabers carving the air in a deadly arc. His form was perfect, honed through centuries of training, his strikes mathematically optimized to eliminate any opponent within seconds. Maggie watched him with the same level of interest she might have given a raccoon rummaging through her trash. Then, with the ease of someone swatting a fly, she swung her shovel. The metal struck his armored shin, with an audible clang. There was a moment of silence, an unnatural stillness, as every spectator, every warrior, every war strategist processing the fight came to the same horrifying realization. Cervex's exoskeletal armor, engineered to withstand plasma fire and explosive impact, was not designed to absorb blunt force trauma from a high-speed farming implement. The shock reverberated through his limbs, triggering a full-body neural response. His war drones, detecting unexpected internal damage, mistakenly categorized him as an injured combatant and initiated emergency incapacitation protocols. With a series of rapid electrical zaps, the Dominion's most celebrated general collapsed in a twitching heap, his sabers deactivating as his limbs seized up. Maggie frowned down at him. "Y'all don't drink enough milk." The crowd did not cheer. They did not jeer. They simply stared, their collective understanding of combat unraveling before their very eyes. The Norvith High Council, observing from their elevated throne, whispered among themselves in increasing panic. The human had moved with no detectable combat form, no precision, no intent, just a simple, devastating action that had felled their greatest warrior. Clorvax the Devourer stepped forward next, snarling. Where Cervex had been a master of precision, Clorvax was a brute force of nature. His claws could carve through steel. His serrated teeth had crushed enemies in half. His kind had been bred for one purpose, war. And he would not suffer the humiliation of his comrades' failure. Maggie studied him for a beat, then adjusted her grip on the shovel. Clorvax lunged, his massive frame coiling with explosive power. He was fast, terrifyingly so. His claws aimed directly at her midsection. A single strike would tear through her, ending the farce once and for all. Maggie swung. The shovel connected with the side of his skull with a resounding thunk. Clorvax froze mid-motion, his pupils dilating. A moment later, his entire body went rigid, his claws twitching before locking up completely. He stood there, unmoving, the momentum of his attack cut short. For several agonizing seconds, nothing happened. Then, slowly, with an almost comical stiffness, Clorvax toppled over like a felled tree, crashing into the arena floor with an earth-shaking thud. Maggie glanced down at his twitching form. Well, that's just embarrassing. From the stands, a chorus of panicked alien voices erupted. Dominion scientists scrambled through their data feeds, desperately analyzing what had just transpired. Clorvax was engineered for battle, his physiology designed for durability. Yet he had fallen to a single, well-placed strike. One Norvith scholar finally deciphered the horror. Maggie had unknowingly struck the precise nerve cluster at the base of Clorvax's skull that rendered his species completely immobile. A weak point so obscure it had never been documented in combat history. To the Dominion, this was not chance. This was strategy. The humans knew. The crowds all twisted into fear. This was no accident. This was precision warfare, disguised as unorthodox brutality. Humanity had sent a warrior so advanced, so dangerously unpredictable, that even their most legendary champions fell before she could break a sweat. The final challenger, AI-98, stepped forward, its sleek mechanical form humming with calculations. Unlike the others, it did not possess emotions. It did not feel fear or anger. It simply analyzed, adjusted, and anticipated. As it studied Maggie, its internal processors ran every possible battle outcome. Over 10,000 simulations, each one mapping a different scenario. AI-98 had never encountered an opponent it could not model, had never seen a fight it could not predict. Yet something was wrong. Every calculated strategy, every recorded data point from the past battles, led to one inescapable conclusion. Probability of defeat, 100%. The AI hesitated, its mechanical mind short-circuiting as it attempted to find an answer that did not exist. The impossibility of victory eroded its logical framework, spiraling into recursive failure. A single alarm blared from within its core, and before the fight could even begin, AI-98 self-destructed. The explosion left a smoldering crater where the war machine had stood, the arena once again falling into stunned silence. Maggie shielded her eyes from the dust cloud, then sighed. Y'all coulda just surrendered. The war moon, which had once witnessed the triumphs of an empire built on battle, now stood as the burial ground of its reputation. The Norvith Dominion had challenged Earth, believing they would face an equal, or at least, an opponent they could understand. Instead, they had been utterly humiliated by an unremarkable human wielding a farming tool. Above, in the High Council's chamber, the ruling elite exchanged frantic glances. This is a disaster, one muttered. Another wiped sweat from his brow. We cannot fight these creatures. The supreme warlord, normally a pillar of confidence, looked sickly. We have only one choice, he murmured. We surrender. Gasps of horror rippled through the room. But, Supreme Warlord. He shook his head. You saw what she did. What else can we do? We send in our best, and she dispatches them, without effort. Either humanity has unlocked combat mastery beyond our understanding, or they have chosen not to show us their true strength. He swallowed, voice barely above a whisper. What if she was holding back? The thought alone was too terrible to comprehend. Down in the arena, Maggie leaned against her shovel, watching as the Norvith scrambled to declare a victor. She had no idea what they were saying, but she could tell from the defeated slump of their shoulders that they weren't in a fighting mood anymore. One of the alien announcers hesitantly cleared his throat, voice trembling as he spoke in halting English. Earth victorious. Please do not destroy us. Maggie frowned. Wasn't planning on it. The relief in the stadium was palpable. The crowd erupted in wild cheers, not for Maggie, but for their own survival. As the interstellar broadcast cut to commercial, the legend of the Shovel Warrior was already beginning to take root. The war moon of Kragath Prime had fallen into stunned silence, a void of disbelief hanging over the crowd like a thick fog. The Norvith Dominion had never known such humiliation. Their greatest warriors had crumbled, one by one, against an opponent who had barely broken a sweat. The impossible reality of the moment was written across the expressions of every alien in attendance, their eyes darting between their fallen champions and the human woman standing alone in the center of the arena, idly tapping her shovel against the ground as if waiting for someone to tell her she could go home. Maggie Blackstone was tired. She had agreed to this nonsense under the assumption it would be over quickly. Instead, she had been beamed halfway across the galaxy, forced to engage in a series of fights that, to her, felt about as difficult as scaring raccoons off her porch. The whole thing was ridiculous. If this was the best the universe had to offer, she had half a mind to march up to whatever galactic authority was in charge and tell them they needed to invest in some sturdier warriors. Across the battlefield, the remaining Norvith officers were paralyzed with indecision. There was one last combatant left, though calling it a combatant was an insult to its nature. AI-98, the most advanced tactical war construct in the Dominion, was not alive in the way the others were. It had no fear, no ego, no pride to bruise. It was pure calculation, an analytical force designed to dismantle an opponent with cold efficiency. Yet, as it remained still, its mechanical frame unmoving, something deeply wrong was occurring within its processing core. AI-98 had run every possible battle scenario against the human, cataloging her previous fights, analyzing movement speed, reaction time, and biomechanical efficiency. None of it made sense. The data did not align with expected combat patterns. This human did not adhere to any known martial strategy. Her attacks were crude, inefficient, and yet overwhelmingly effective. This was an anomaly. AI-98 did not process anomalies well. A second set of simulations was initiated, a deeper dive into human combat history. Data logs scoured through centuries of war, human tactics, adaptability, strategic misdirection. The sheer chaos of human warfare was unlike any other species the Dominion had encountered. And then there was her. No discernible training. No enhancements. Just a woman and a shovel, dismantling elite warriors in ways that should not have been possible. It was a paradox. AI-98 reran the calculations. The result came back the same. Probability of victory, 0%. The war construct froze, its internal processors looping the conclusion over and over. No opponent had ever been beyond prediction. No battle had ever been fought where AI 98 could not determine an optimal path to victory. This was not a fight. This was imminent destruction. A deep hum resonated from AI 98's core, an emergency failsafe activating. A warning flickered across its internal display. Self-preservation mode engaged. Defensive retreat protocol initializing. In the High Council's observation chamber, the Norvith strategists leaned forward, watching in confusion as their last great warrior stood motionless in the arena. AI 98's optical sensors flickered erratically. A glow were emanating from its body. And then, without warning, it detonated. A sharp, blinding explosion erupted where the construct had stood, sending a shockwave through the arena. Smoke and debris filled the air, the walls of the Colosseum shaking under the impact. The crowd gasped, shielding their eyes, their expressions morphing from awe to outright terror. Maggie merely stood there, blinking away dust. She spat to the side, unimpressed. She muttered. Guess it didn't have the stomach for it. The Norvith were spiraling into full-blown panic. From a High Council's observation deck, Supreme Warlord Jorlvok clutched the edge of his throne, his normally steady hands trembling. He had anticipated fight, even a hard-won victory, but what he had witnessed was beyond warfare. This was annihilation. The human had not simply defeated the Dominion's best warriors. She had unraveled the very foundation of their martial philosophy. Their greatest war mind had just self-terminated rather than face her. This was no mere duel. This was a declaration. Jorlvok turned to his advisors, his voice barely above a whisper. She must be a weapon. A murmur of agreement rippled through the chamber. No organic warrior could defeat our champions so easily, one of them hissed. She must be an experimental super soldier, a final evolution of human warfare. Another, pale with realization, stammered. They sent one to test us. If she is their scout, then how powerful are their armies? The question hung in the air, suffocating the room with its implications. On the arena floor, the announcer, an insectoid creature whose mandibles were twitching in sheer panic, scrambled to regain control. The pretense of a noble battle had long since dissolved. Now only one question remained. What would the human demand in return for mercy? A microphone was thrust toward Maggie, its trembling holder barely able to speak. The Earth is victorious. Mighty human, what are your terms? Maggie squinted at him. Terms. Yes, the announcer stammered, your conditions of surrender. She wrinkled her nose. I didn't surrender. The alien practically fell over himself, trying to correct. Our surrender. The Dominion's surrender. We submit to your strength. Maggie narrowed her eyes. Are you saying y'all lost? The announcer gave a frantic nod. Yes. Unquestionably. Completely. She exhaled through her nose, shaking her head. You mean to tell me y'all dragged me across the stars for this nonsense, wrecked my afternoon, and now you want to give up? She leaned against her shovel, expression unreadable. That don't sit right with me. The council members, watching from above, clutched their seats, preparing for the worst. Jorlvok whispered, we are doomed. Maggie sighed. I don't need surrender. I need a fair deal. The alien stiffened, uncertain. She raised a hand, ticking off fingers as she spoke. First, you're going to fix my fence. Second, I want compensation for my lost crops. Third, I expect an apology for dragging me into this whole mess. She adjusted her grip on her shovel. And fourth, y'all are going to help me harvest. The warlords watching the broadcast nearly fainted. Jorlvok choked. Did she just demand labor? The room was silent. Maggie crossed her arms. If you want to prove y'all are tough, you're going to do it properly. You're going to spend a full season working my land. And if you make it through without crying, I'll consider us even. The Norvith, a race of conquerors, a civilization built on war, had never known true hardship. Their military campaigns had been swift, their victories decisive. But the concept of farming? Of waking at dawn, working under an unforgiving sun, laboring for months without promise of immediate reward? It was the most terrifying prospect they had ever encountered. Jorlvok, realizing the alternative was worse, straightened. We accept." Maggie gave a curt nod. "Good. Y'all got strong backs. Figure you can put 'em to use." The deal was struck. As the broadcast cut out, word of the humans' demands spread like wildfire. Across the galaxy, whispers of the shovel warrior grew into legend, a symbol of humanity's terrifying power. No battle fleets, no grand armies, just a single woman who had bent the Dominion's will with nothing more than stubborn practicality. Maggie adjusted her hat. "Well," she muttered, "guess I better get home." The war moon of Kragath Prime had seen the rise and fall of empires, its history stained with the blood of countless warriors, yet nothing in its long existence could compare to the absurdity of what had just transpired. The Norvith Dominion, a civilization that had spent centuries expanding its reach through ruthless conquest, had not only been bested in combat, but had been utterly broken by the sheer, incomprehensible nature of human unpredictability. And, at the center of it all, standing with the same level of exasperation as a woman who had been pulled from her daily routine and thrust into intergalactic nonsense, was Maggie Blackstone, gripping her dented shovel like she had every intention of putting it to use again if anyone tested her patience. The reality of their situation settled into the bones of the Norvith High Council. Their warriors had fallen, their greatest warmind had self-destructed, and the human, who had displayed no discernible strategy beyond sheer brute stubbornness, had not even considered them a true threat. But it was not just the defeat that chilled them. It was her terms of mercy. No demands for planetary surrender. No technological tributes. No leveraging Earth's victory into political gain. Just labor. The most feared warriors in the galaxy had been sentenced not to death, but to farming. And that was the part that terrified them the most. The first wave of conscripted Norvith laborers arrived on Earth 2 weeks later, a delegation of battle-hardened soldiers who had spent their entire lives conquering, only to find themselves assigned to tasks like herding cattle and repairing fences. They were not prepared for the toil. Their exoskeletal armor, designed to resist the piercing force of plasma rounds, did absolutely nothing against the relentless heat of a Nebraska summer. Their combat reflexes, trained for war, failed them against the coordinated fury of an angry rooster guarding Maggie's barn. And their endurance, tested in the brutal conditions of alien battlefields, proved worthless when faced with the sheer, soul-crushing monotony of harvesting corn. By the second month, their ranks had dwindled. Not from desertion, no, they were too honorable for that, but from the realization that this was what true suffering felt like. War was glorious. War was a declaration of strength, of willpower, of legacy. This was humbling. Maggie took to her role as their overseer with the same no-nonsense attitude she had always had, treating the Norvith warriors no differently than she would an unruly farmhand who thought too highly of himself. There was no room for ego in hard labor. If they wanted to prove themselves, they would do it by showing up before sunrise, by pulling their weight without complaint, by learning the simple yet unrelenting rhythm of life on Earth. It changed them. Somewhere between plowing fields and fixing irrigation lines, the once fearsome warriors of the Dominion began to understand why the humans had sent her. It was not that she was their greatest warrior, far from it. It was that she embodied something far more dangerous than strength. Resilience. A warrior could break. A warrior could be defeated, forced to kneel. But a farmer? A farmer endured. A farmer planted in the face of uncertainty, toiled through harsh seasons, suffered through failures, and kept going. Maggie had not won because she was stronger. She had won because she refused to lose. The realization rippled through the Dominion. The surrender, which had initially been seen as an unthinkable disgrace, transformed into something else entirely. The Norvith who had survived Maggie's farm returned to their homeworld not as warriors, but as something greater. They had been broken. Yes, but in that breaking, they had been rebuilt. They carried with them the lessons learned in the fields, the knowledge that true power was not in domination, but in perseverance. The unintended consequences of Earth's victory spread further than anyone could have anticipated. Word of the shovel warrior reached every corner of the galaxy. growing with each retelling. Some spoke of her as a divine force, an avatar of destruction so powerful that she had turned the Dominion into her personal workforce with nothing more than sheer will and a gardening tool. Others believed she was the herald of a hidden human empire, a warning that if the galactic community ever threatened Earth again, the next human they sent would not be so merciful. Panic set in among the other major interstellar factions. Treaties were drawn up before Earth had even asked for them. Trade negotiations were initiated under the assumption that humanity was far too powerful to be left isolated. Fleets that had once patrolled the outer reaches of the galaxy gave Earth a wide berth, fearing the day they might see a second envoy arrive, not with an armada, but with a second farmer. The political landscape shifted overnight, and the people of Earth, largely unaware of what had even transpired, found themselves suddenly at the center of galactic diplomacy. Scientific advances, alien technology, untold riches, all of it offered freely, out of a fear so deep it had rewritten the entire fabric of interstellar power. Maggie, of course, knew none of this. She had returned to her quiet life, the galaxy's turmoil meaning little to a woman with chores to finish. If she noticed the strange, reverent way the Norvith farmhands still working her land spoke to her, she did not mention it. If she found it odd that emissaries from alien civilizations occasionally stopped by to observe her work, she simply ignored them. And if she wondered why, on more than one occasion, entire fleets stationed themselves on the outer edges of Earth's solar system before suddenly retreating, she simply chalked it up to more bureaucratic nonsense and went about her day. But the legend of Maggie Blackstone had already taken on a life of its own. Somewhere in the distant reaches of space, a Norva scholar compiled the first entry of what would become a sacred text among their people, the teachings of the Shovel Warrior. It chronicled not only the battles fought, but the lessons learned, the endurance, the humility, the unwavering will to persist in the face of adversity. It was not long before whispers of a new warrior class began to form among the Dominion. No longer soldiers, no longer conquerors. Farmers. Not just in title, but in practice. A new generation of Norvith warriors abandoned their weapons and took to the soil, training in the harshest conditions, learning to endure the unyielding trials of nature itself. Their armor was traded for work-worn gloves, their battle cries replaced with the rhythmic hum of toil. They would not fight for glory. They would cultivate. And when the time came, should any force threaten their home, they would stand. Not as soldiers, not as conquerors, as farmers. Back in Nebraska, Maggie Blackstone wiped the sweat from her brow, looking out over the freshly tilled fields. The sun was setting, casting golden light over the land she had fought so hard to keep. She adjusted her hat, gave a nod of approval, and slung her shovel over her shoulder. The war moon of Cragath Prime had never seen anything like her, and it never would again.